Before the pipe organ came to belong to the church, it was used for a much older purpose. Its deepest tones were not selected for their musical beauty, but rather for how they acted upon human bone. The civilization responsible for their creation understood sound in ways that modern science is only now beginning to verify. Before we get into all of that, drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Step inside virtually any cathedral across Europe, and you will see it positioned high upon the rear wall, just above the main entrance and facing the altar. Thousands of pipes stand in exacting formation, varying in width from that of a single finger to the diameter of a grown man's torso, and in length from about the span of a hand to the height of a two-story building. The pipe organ stands as the largest musical instrument ever constructed and the most intricate mechanical device produced in the pre-industrial age. Yet, when you inspect it closely, the standard historical narrative begins to seem almost nonsensical. According to the official account, the pipe organ was first developed in ancient Greece, later spread across the Roman world as a form of entertainment, then faded into religious use during medieval Europe, and over time grew more and more elaborate as cathedral builders tried to surpass one another in size and aesthetic grandeur. Each organ was a proud symbol of both civic and religious achievement, painstakingly assembled by master artisans over many decades. But the engineering behind Europe's great organs does not align with a story of gradual improvement. The instruments placed in the major cathedrals during the 18th and early 19th centuries were not simply more advanced iterations of an evolving technology. Instead, they represented a peak of acoustic and mechanical refinement that later generations of builders could barely preserve and often could not recreate. When these organs malfunctioned, the craftsmen called in to fix them frequently could not comprehend the principles behind the specific tonal combinations that had been achieved. The shaping of the pipes involved methods that modern organ builders have spent decades laboring to reverse engineer. The voicing process, the exact adjustment of each pipe to generate not merely a pitch, but a specific tonal quality at a given pressure, was accomplished through techniques that left behind no written explanation. Sound itself is simply pressure waves propagating through a medium at frequencies detectable by human ears, roughly between 20 and 20 Zavalosan hertz. Within that range, the waves are short enough that we perceive them as distinct tones. Below 20 hertz, however, the wavelengths grow very long, and the pressure changes happen too slowly for the ear to register them as pitch. What the body experiences then is not sound in the ordinary sense, but physical vibration transmitted through flesh, bone, and internal organs. This is the territory of infrasound, and its effects on the human body are well documented, reproducible, and profoundly unusual. Infrasound at approximately 18 Hz has been shown to cause disturbances in human visual perception, including spontaneous oscillation of the eyeballs within their sockets, a phenomenon known as resonant eyeball vibration. This produces visual anomalies, sometimes described as sensing something in the peripheral vision that is not truly there. This specific frequency has been detected in locations associated with hauntings and paranormal experiences. Researchers, including British engineer Vic Tandy, who published his findings during the 1990s, demonstrated that 18 Hz infrasound generated by an industrial fan was responsible for the sensations of dread, unease, and visual distortion reported at a purportedly haunted laboratory in Coventry. The building's reputation for being haunted disappeared once the fan was adjusted. At even lower frequencies, around 8 to 12 Hz, sound begins to interact with brainwave activity. The brain's alpha wave state, which corresponds to relaxed yet alert awareness, operates within this 8 to 12 Hz range. Sound waves at these frequencies can synchronize brain activity, steering the mind toward altered states of consciousness. This is not mere speculation. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its most carefully formulated version, proposes that prior to the civilization documented in mainstream history, there existed a worldwide or near worldwide culture of extraordinary technical sophistication. It further suggests that the grand buildings of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the cathedrals, exhibition halls, and civic structures with their immense domes and precision stonework, were not constructed by the civilization that inherited them. Instead, they were remnants of that earlier culture, later reoccupied and adapted after some catastrophic disruption. This argument draws on a category of historical anomalies that mainstream historians have not adequately addressed. The technical capability implied by many 18th and 19th century construction projects does not align with the documented industrial capacity of that era. The speed at which enormous buildings were supposedly raised using hand tools and animal labor seems implausible when compared against modern calculations of the required man-hours. Photographs and engravings from the mid-19th century depict buildings in states of partial ruin or infill, suggesting they were being modified and repurposed rather than built from scratch. Doors and windows appear at elevations indicating that ground floors were buried rather than that the structures were originally designed with entrances at ground level. Within this framework, the pipe organs found in the great cathedrals were not crafted by medieval or early modern artisans. They were discovered. They were maintained imperfectly by craftsmen who did not fully grasp the principles underlying their construction. The frequency ranges they produced, including their infrasonic lower registers, were not accidental byproducts of scale. They were deliberate specifications, and the buildings housing them were not primarily places of worship. They were facilities for treatment, or more precisely, resonance chambers designed to channel specific frequency combinations through particular architectural spaces in order to induce particular physical effects in people positioned within them. Cathedral architecture is remarkable for its acoustic properties in ways that cannot be wholly explained by the aesthetic inclinations of medieval builders. The proportions of nave width to ceiling height, the positioning of side chapels, the curve of apses, and the depth of transepts are not merely structural or visual decisions. They are acoustic ones, shaping how sound behaves throughout the space. Europe's cathedrals were constructed before acoustics existed as a formal science. The term acoustics was not coined until the 17th century, and the mathematical analysis of room modes, the frequencies at which a space naturally resonates based on its dimensions, came much later. Yet the great cathedrals behave acoustically, as if they were designed by someone with a quantitative grasp of room modes. Chartres Cathedral in France, for example, has a nave approximately 37 meters wide and 30 meters tall. The fundamental room mode for a space of those dimensions falls within the infrasonic range. The room naturally resonates at frequencies below human hearing. When the organ at Chartres produces its lowest notes, it is not contending with the room. It is exciting the room's own natural resonances, adding its energy to frequency relationships that the architecture establishes on its own. The same pattern recurs in cathedral after cathedral across Europe. The architectural proportions consistently yield fundamental room modes in the infrasonic range. The organs consistently generate output that reaches into those same frequencies. The geometry is far too consistent to be accidental. Someone with an understanding of acoustic physics designed these spaces to serve as resonant chambers. and the organs were the driving mechanisms within them. If the pipe organ functioned as a medical instrument within the Tartarian framework, you would anticipate finding evidence of its use in healing contexts. And you would also anticipate that such evidence would either be absent from the historical record or deliberately marginalized. What you actually find is something closer to the latter. The historical literature on the therapeutic applications of music is extensive and reaches back to ancient sources. Pythagoras prescribed specific musical modes for particular physical and psychological conditions. The Pythagorean understanding of music was explicitly medical rather than aesthetic. Specific intervals, specific modes, and specific instruments were linked to specific bodily effects. This tradition continued through the medieval and Renaissance periods, documented in the writings of figures such as Marsilio Ficino, the 15th century Florentine scholar who wrote extensively on the use of music and sound to influence bodily states. The great organs of the early modern period existed at precisely the cultural moment when this tradition of therapeutic music remained active and intellectually respectable. Physicians of the 17th and 18th centuries had not yet made the clean division between music as medicine and music as art that would become standard in the 19th century. In the medical literature of that period, you find specific references to the effects of deep organ tones on melancholic conditions, on pain, and on states of physical agitation. These mentions are brief and scattered, not systematic. They read like allusions to a practice that was common knowledge and required no elaboration, rather than descriptions of an unusual or controversial treatment. In 1973, a Norwegian educator named Olav Skill began experimenting with the therapeutic effects of low-frequency sound delivered directly to the body through vibrating furniture. He called the approach vibroacoustic therapy. The frequencies he found most effective, in the range of 30 to 80 hertz, were exactly those produced by the lower registers of a large pipe organ. The conditions that responded most favorably to treatment included chronic muscle tension, complications in bone healing, and neurological pain disorders. Skill's work was followed by a growing body of research in the decades that followed. By the early 2000s, vibroacoustic therapy, using frequencies between 30 and 100 hertz, was being studied in clinical settings for applications such as stimulating bone healing after fractures, managing tremors associated with Parkinson's disease, reducing muscle conditions, and treating anxiety and depressive states. The frequency ranges employed in these clinical contexts were not chosen because researchers theorized they ought to work based on acoustic principles. They were selected because they were found to work through experimental observation, and they overlap consistently and entirely with the frequency ranges that a cathedral organ produces in its lower registers when its largest pipes are speaking. The organ builders of Tartaria, within the framework that takes that civilization seriously, did not stumble upon these frequencies by chance, nor did they deploy them in buildings accidentally optimized for their amplification and distribution. They arrived at them the way any sophisticated medical tradition arrives at its treatments, through systematic observation of what works, refined over time, and embedded in institutions and physical infrastructure that would persist even after the theoretical knowledge behind them had been lost or suppressed. The mainstream position on all of this is straightforward. The cathedrals were built by medieval and early modern artisans expressing religious devotion. The organs were constructed to supply music for services. The acoustic properties of the buildings resulted from builders following conventional architectural wisdom, without any specific acoustic calculations. Any therapeutic effects of low-frequency organ music are incidental byproducts of instruments designed for other purposes. This position, however, requires you to accept a string of coincidences. It demands that you accept that builders without acoustic knowledge consistently produced buildings with acoustically optimized low-frequency resonant properties. It demands that you accept that organ builders without physiological knowledge consistently created instruments whose lowest ranges coincide with clinically confirmed therapeutic frequencies. It also demands that you accept that the tradition of therapeutic music vanished from medical literature at precisely the moment when institutional medicine was defining its own boundaries. None of these coincidences are individually impossible. Taken together, however, they form a pattern that the Tartaria framework explains more coherently than the standard account. What was lost was not merely a civilization. It was a medical technology embedded in architecture, in instruments, in spatial design, in the specific relationship between a building and the machine installed within it. The pipe organs are still there. Some of them are still playing. The frequencies they emit are still moving through the bodies of people seated in those spaces, affecting bone and brain and tissue in ways the occupants do not realize are happening. Because the knowledge of what the instrument was originally for vanished before their grandparents were even born. The pipe organ did not begin as a religious instrument. It began as a device for working upon the human body through sound. Tartaria constructed them at a scale we have not since matched. The frequencies they selected correspond to biological effects that modern research confirms are real. What was lost in the reset was not just architecture. It was medicine.